Good evening, everyone. Kalispera σας. I hope you're all well. Allow me to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome to tonight's presentation by London-based academic and scholar, Professor Gonda van Steen, on the battle for bodies, hearts, and minds in post-war Greece. Social worker Charles Schermerhorn in Thessaloniki, 1946 to 1951. However, just some household items we need to get through. As we are in winter, our next seminar will be in early July. We'll also be online, and this will be followed by a 1-month winter break before we return in August. Some lucky few will probably be in Greece, but that's another story. Specifically, next week's Thursday, 3rd of July seminar will be by Dr. Angelikeli Vanoudi on gender in modern Greek, the modern Greek language, and something that should appeal to a lot of our educators out there. Don't also forget there is a Kavafi for Beginners workshop that will take place in August. Spaces are limited. There are literally only a handful of spots left, so enroll early while there's still slots available. It will be delivered by Professor Michalis Pakogiannis from the Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki. Furthermore, for those who are members of the Greek community of Melbourne, and for those who are eligible to renew their membership, elections will be held at Alton Grammar this Sunday, the 29th of June. Booths are open between 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Hope to see you as many people there as possible. I'd also like to thank tonight's sponsor, Penny Zigarello Makison, and we encourage you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice during the course of the year. There's still a few seminars without a sponsor. Now let's return to tonight's topic, the battle for bodies, hearts, and minds in post-war Greece. Social worker Charles Schermerhorn in Thessaloniki, 1946-51. The onset of the Greek Civil War coincided with the onset of the Cold War. The UK, the US, and the Soviet Union might have been allies during World War II, and this combined alliance was able to inflict a heavy defeat on Nazi Germany. But after the war had ended, the goalposts had changed. For the US and the West, the new enemies were now the Soviet Union, its supporters, and communism. Both the US and the USSR were triumphant after the war and wanted to leverage both this influence and success, hence the battle for the hearts and minds of global citizens. This also played out in Greece. The exhausted Britain passed on the reins to the USA, which in turn, through its Truman Doctrine and later Marshall Plan, invested in Greece in a multifaceted way, not just materially, to ensure they remained in the Western camp, the Western sphere of influence. Influencing the upbringing and rearing of children was also one of the battlegrounds, as these were your future workers, your future decision makers, and your future leaders. Today's presentation is about American social worker and child welfare specialist Charles Schermerhorn, who arrived in Greece during this time. In the course of a mere 5 years, he was stationed there by the UNNRA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, where Charles saw a tremendous amount of American-influenced administrative and logistical planning for Greece, which was the focus of intense early Cold War friction and scrutiny. This presentation is about his story and what he witnessed. And to give this presentation, we're very happy to welcome back Professor Gonda van Steen. She's been a regular in this series. She's the Careers Chair of Modern Greek and Byzantium History, Language and Literature in the Department of Classics at King's College in London. She received her PhD in Classics and Hellenic Studies from Princeton University. Gonda is the author of 5 books. Her most recent ones are Adoption, Memory and Cold War in 2019, about the Greek children that got adopted during the Cold War, that title takes the reader into an uncharted terrain of Greek adoption stories that became paradigmatic of Cold War history and politics. This title has also been translated recently in Greece as well by the publisher Potamos. Ζητούν την παιδιά από την Ελλάδα is the title. With regards to this presentation, there is a title coming out. Well, it's already come out, but the paperback will be out sort of next month, published by Routledge. Enough for me. I pass the baton on to our invited speaker, Professor Gonda van Steen.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for you. I'm so pleased to be with you again, and thank you, Nick, and thank you, Kostas Avlonitis, for supporting these lectures and for devoting so much of your time and effort to this wonderful initiative, but also for providing the technical backup to make these lectures possible. I speak to you from the USA, and I think I scared Nick there a little bit by not responding to his call up till a very short while ago. But we just woke up here, and not to worry, I've had my coffee, and we're ready to delve in. I also want to extend a special thanks to Penny Zagarello Makisun, the sponsor of this session, with whom I've had the pleasure to speak in person and to meet up in Greece. And we are connected in research and also in the ways of friendship. So thank you, Penny. So my talk then today, and let me structure it for you. My talk, sketching the archival background of how this book came about, sketching then the larger background in history and culture in US-Greek relations, in which our main character, Charles Schermerhorn, fits, to then delve into the personal story and the personal activities of the 5 years that Charles spent in Greece, the contacts he made, and then reflect a little bit on the meaning of his work. What difference could he make? And this is all the more relevant and relative, because while I find myself in the US, there's a lot of talk here of how much a country wants to invest in aid abroad, in involvement abroad, in controversial involvement abroad. And so it's quite a good exercise for me, especially in Texas, to kind of look back at a different kind of history in which Americans, humanitarian aid workers then, were involved in other parts of the world, and how that has been perceived in the long run and what became of it. So this is this kind of question of where we need to be, with what kind of power we need to be there, and what kind of goodwill, money, military equipment. All these questions are still very prominently with us. But let me then delve into what I promised to be the archival story. And this is where something that comes in that I really love, which is sheer chance, serendipity. So I had done some work on the adoptions, and through the grapevine, I hear of this story of a set of boxes in San Francisco that belonged to the son of Charles Schermerhorn, David Schermerhorn, and it's my opportunity to thank him as well. And so David had inherited from his father, Charles, a set of boxes and photographs, basically all the material of a memoir of the 5 years that the family spent in Greece, with Charles being the traditional head of the family, the breadwinner, and the family at that time consisting of first 2, then 3 children who were indeed settled in Greece. So Charles had done meticulous work of, keeping notes, diaries, photographs, newspaper clippings, had put it all in boxes in San Francisco. He and his son had been organizing it, indexing it. David Schermerhorn was going to publish it, but by the time David reached the age of 80, this became an increasingly overwhelming project. And there I also say emotional project, because his father had long died by then, and the burden felt particularly heavy, and also a sense of time running out. And so out came then the plan of maybe giving this to somebody else, somebody who was less emotionally involved and who could see the project through as a publication project. And I was immediately keen to do so. But I felt there was a different kind of responsibility here as well. There is not just me stepping in and making a publication project out of it. There is also the preservation of the archive, which is important for future generations and quite unique. And so we got in touch with Yorgos Paganellis at the Cal State University in Sacramento, the Tsakopoulos Hellenic Collection in Sacramento, and together with George, focusing on acquiring the archive, classifying it, preparing the finding aid, making sure the pictures were preserved, and me simultaneously working on a publication. That was just a partnership made in heaven. And I dare say with some pride that in 2.5 years we accomplished all of it. Both the publication of the memoir with original pictures taken by Charles Schermerhorn. They show big in the book, and the picture of the family that made the poster is one of them. But they're really these tiny little photographs, black and white, from back in the day. But here there are some 300 authentic photographs to illustrate authentic writings. So it's about as good as it gets. And I'm very proud of both the archival accomplishment and of course, the publication. The book must also exist as an online book, and I'm very glad that Nick noticed that it's coming out in paperback, because otherwise the price of it is horrendous. And so if you just wait long enough, there is access to it in a more affordable way. So this is a story then to sketch the larger background of American humanitarian assistance in the post-war era to countries that were most afflicted by the Nazi German occupation. And of course, Greece is almost a school book example of how much destruction the Nazis could wreak on an entire country, not only the population, but also agriculture, infrastructure. So the cry for help of Greece goes out very quickly after the war, and the Americans respond, but first of all, not as the United States by themselves, but in the first phase as an alliance with the former allies. And one of the first organizations that comes about to provide that kind of aid is the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, better known as UNRRA with double R. And sure enough, UNRRA is at that time still a collaboration of the Americans, the Brits, but also the Russians, for instance. We kind of forget that. And of course, we have reason to forget it, because the Cold War will soon enough divide the former allies and make everyone retreat their own opposite camps. UNRRA was still a joint venture at the time. And the Brits played quite a role administratively, but the Americans paid most of the money, which also gives the Americans a bit of a sense that they run the show. That's not necessarily for the better. So we get then a look at this first massive worldwide, when you think of it, experiment in providing humanitarian aid to war-torn countries. UNRWA does tremendous recruiting, and our Charles, who is a mid-career social worker with some experience in prison work in San Francisco, Alcatraz, and all these places, signs up and gets a job. And actually, a lot of women get jobs too. UNRWA is this organization that puts about 1/4 to occasionally 40% of women to work in an international theater of operations, which I find quite women who get jobs as interpreters, administrators, healthcare workers, you name it. So there's more going on here than infrastructural rebuilding. There's also agricultural advice. There is welfare work. Charles comes on as a child welfare specialist with UNRWA. And so this is a new kind of world order in which clearly the Americans will take more and more of a lead, but clearly emphasizing what we call the soft power sector, humanitarian aid with a longer-term perspective of establishing a lasting influence. And when the demarcation lines between the West and the rest are free market and communism, when those demarcation lines become more clearly drawn, then we see that humanitarian assistance taking on even more of a soft power dimension. It has to do some legwork, let me say, to make a Western system more attractive. It is what the Americans call the battle for hearts and minds. You can win the war, but there's also work to be done to win the peace. And the Americans are investing at that time millions of dollars to do so. To the phrase the battle for hearts and minds, I've added the word bodies because there are still a lot of bodies to be saved, to be fed. And for Charles, that becomes the very literal work of feeding, especially children, and especially in the northern territory of Greece, where soon enough the civil war will kick in and be raging at its worst. So our Charles comes in. Let me work on the slides here. Yeah. Our Charles comes in at kind of a mid-level foot soldier, dare I say, of this large humanitarian aid experiment. And I find that particularly important to look at mid-level career persons. We've written so much of our history, especially 20th century history, especially modern Greek history, let's be honest, around the big names of history, which tend to be males of a certain age. With Charles, we get a look at how one cog in a larger system operates with his own personal impressions, which can be uncensored. He does not have to prove that he got his position or his leadership. He does not have to justify it. He does not have to validate it. He can therefore be much more personal and much more authentic. And if anything, provide this with a much more critical source on what happens. And he has a lot of criticism in store, which is actually quite healthy to read. So when Charles arrives as a child welfare specialist for UNRRA, he comes with a background, being by now in his early 40s, he comes with a background of what they call in America the Roosevelt New Deal mentality. Roosevelt, who made the New Deal in response to the Great Depression of 1929, trying to revitalize certain sectors of the American economy, but also trying to do some additional work with minority groups, racial minority groups, economically disadvantaged groups, especially in the American South. And so out of that kind of social welfare thinking comes a person like Charles who has absorbed that, and even the even bolder thinking that what works in America can be transferred to northern Greece, and let's see if it works. A certain kind of idealism that with the ideal of American rationalism and efficiency, you can make a good model, you can implement a good model just about anywhere in the world. So you see a certain idealism at work and a certain, dare I say, missionary zeal. And it's not at all a surprise to you that Charles indeed comes out of a background where missionaries went abroad. He'd done some theological studies at the Princeton Seminary himself. He eventually didn't stick with the more religious side of a career, but the religious thinking and the idea that you have to go out in the world and do the kind of apostolic work of doing good elsewhere is still very much on his mind. And occasionally he reflects on his a certain kind of sense of duty, religious sense of duty in that light. Now, mind you, you're immediately going to say, is this all not a little bit colonial? Let's go and help the natives. Sure, it is. And Charles doesn't necessarily see it. We see it large and clear. But back in the day, there is indeed a spirit of we're needed in the world, we need to rush to help, we need to follow even the biblical quote that we have to go and rush to the help of Macedonia. We have to follow in the footsteps of St. Paul, which is why, again, Northern Greece is particularly attractive. Think of Thessaloniki, Veria. All of those backgrounds definitely come into play. And there is indeed a sense that the Americans should break out of their isolationism and go and do some good in the world. That also means that occasionally we find our Charles very out of touch with local realities, with long-standing traditions that work for Greece and of which the Americans have no idea. So there is definitely a sense of culture clash and culture shock on both ends. And it's kind of, I had to actually work with Charles' son to put that critical dimension coming from me in the book as well, because this is not, I didn't want this book to be the story of a hero who goes off and changes Greece. I would also like to state that Greece changed him for being more resilient, more persistent, better informed than he could ever have thought. So let that be. But on the other hand, then, it needs to be said that in terms of a source of an American going to Greece, writing about an intense 5 years and leaving that entire record behind, illustrated with newspaper articles and pictures, people, there is nothing like it. There is nothing comparable. And we could only wish more of this kind of material comes out of boxes, whether in San Francisco or anywhere in the world. And if it does, I'm just going to jump on it because it was a great project to complete. And it's the kind of history writing where I think we can still make a very innovative contribution. So let's then look a little more closely as what happens with our Charles, right? He arrives in Greece in May of 1946. And everyone is so happy because the liberation has kicked in. Everybody thinks the war is over. When he arrives, UNRRA has already done a lot of work in Greece. And actually, when he first arrived, the UNRRA officials just tell him, you're actually no longer needed here. We're going to close down the shop soon enough. And sure enough, by the end of 46, UNRRA is liquidating in Greece. So the first cold shower is that with all his idealism and missionary zeal, the people on the ground in Greece tell him, hey, our work is actually as good as done. If you want, you could just as well go back to where you came from. Talking about the bureaucratic shock, right? And so Charles, on the ground, settles in quite quickly. He likes the work. He likes the responsibility for children. It gives him an opportunity to kind of delve into the struggles of the Greek family, for which he has a lot of sympathy, an extraordinary amount of sympathy, I must say, because in all these contexts, children are easily forgotten. So as soon as Charles senses that UNRRA isn't going to be there for much longer, he basically starts looking for new ways to stay in Greece for longer. Also because he likes it and he finds it the experience of a lifetime to basically educate himself on another culture. And then he tries to affiliate with the Near East Relief, which has a long-standing history in the Middle East that actually comes out of the Armenian genocide and taking care of Armenian refugees in the 20s and other refugees, also of the 20s, Greek and others, who settled, again, mostly in northern Greece. And so he affiliates himself with the Near East Relief, which soon enough becomes the Near East Foundation, again doing work for children. So he is already rolling from the first job into the second affiliation. And then when that winds down, because Charles was responsible for, again, work in northern Greece, and the civil war kicks in, little did he know, then he will eventually affiliate with UNICEF, which is then just about being formed. So in the 5 years that Charles covers, he basically is a representative for 3 different organizations in which he manages to keep the focus on benefit. That in itself is a remarkable feat, to be able to write all these various traditions and to still keep in mind what he most came to do, working with children, feeding children in the very literal sense. For the Near East Foundation, Charles runs the hostels of northern Greece. And those of you who are from northern Greece may remember that these were called eagle's nests. And there was one in Konitsa, there was one in Florina. What the hostels would do in some sort of an anticipation of the famous pedopolis of Queen Frederica, what these hostels would do is basically house children from the poor mountain villages, and they would go and select them in these villages. And so these children would be invited to stay at these hostels for about 3 to 4 months. They would be washed, fed, clothed, entertained, educated, a little bit indoctrinated, yeah, and then eventually being sent back to their villages. So that these children would kind of enjoy a period of being, dare I say, strengthened with good food and education before being sent back to the villages. So Charles spends actually a lot of time going around villages, looking for the weakest children, convincing the parents to let them stay in these institutions, and then taking them back to the villages. It's an extraordinary experiment, and we just kind of think, how desperate parents must be to let their children go, and they are, and they really are. But what you see where I'm going with this, what it prepares us for is this is a very much of a thinking about child healthcare through institutionalization and through gathering up the children. We'll get there back in a second, but I know Nick is already thinking ahead. This hostile structure then is completely disrupted by the hostilities of the Civil War. When Charles arrived in Greece in 1946, in May of 46, he has no idea that by the end of the year, we are deep in the Greek Civil War. Everybody thinks the worst is over. Few could have thought that the worst was still to come. And so Charles actually has already brought over his family in the summer of 46, including a new wife, his second wife, and 2 young children, the oldest of which is our David, and he shows us the little boy in the picture. So Charles has by now a young family, 2 children, and soon a third on the way, in the very center of a civil war in Greece. He relocates the family from Athens to Thessaloniki, and they live in a house in Thessaloniki that is actually still standing. They rent a place. Charles makes a very deliberate effort not to belong, meaning not to belong to the expat community of the British and the Americans in Thessaloniki and their clubs and their special shops and all of it. He wants the authentic living experience, and therefore he goes out of his way to find a normal house and give his children a normal sense of belonging to a city. And the children run with Greek, pick it up, have their little friends. His wife becomes very good at Greek. The only one who actually lags a little bit in picking up the Greek language is Charles himself. And so a lot of what he writes and a lot of what he perceives goes through the eyes of an interpreter. And that's, of course, a huge caveat because we like our sources to be more authentic than that. We all know, those of us who do archival work and collect oral testimonies in Greece, we know just how important it is to speak Greek. One must miss out on 50% of the good stuff for not speaking Greek. And yet Charles surprises us because he does ask the penetrating questions and becomes friends with his interpreters and travels to so many villages to hear different perspectives that he even convinced me that he leaves an authentic record behind, or at least has his eyes open enough to integrate various perspectives. So he does, in a way, help us over the hurdle that is the language. But he never became any good at Greek, I can tell you that. But back to that organized structure of gathering up the children to give them 3 or 4 months of buffering them up, let's say, to make sure that they can withstand the harsh living conditions of the villages and especially of the northern winters. Soon enough, these hostels need to be closed because in Florina and Konica, you know what happens. The attacks of the communist forces, the guerrilla forces, become more and more intense, and it just isn't safe enough to keep children there and to keep them separated from their parents, who are hugely worried. And then two things start to happen that are better known to us. The Queen Frederica opens up these children's hostels that they call pedopolis and that have ever since been associated with the royal family. And we call that movement of gathering up the children from the north and bringing them further south in Greece. We've called that pedophylarma, the saving of the children. Again, this is a form of institutionalization, education, feeding, and let's be honest, a fair amount of indoctrination. The day starts with prayer. The day starts with, flag raising, portraits of the king and the queen everywhere. The queen is presented as the mother to all Greeks, and especially the mother to the orphan children of Greece. We immediately need to combine that movement with another evacuation campaign, because both campaigns will eventually claim the banner of humanitarian evacuation, with the evacuation of the communist forces on their retreat across the northern borders, and then taking children along again from the northern villages. We call that the pedomazoma, which has a much more negative term, the gathering up of the children. Some people will say the kidnapping of the children, to take them out of the northern territories and bring them to safety in institutions in Yugoslavia back in the day, but also as far north as Poland. So these children then get scattered over the various communist states of the Soviet Union, where again institutionalization is the norm. These are very contested movements. There's a whole literature about them. The second one is far more contested because the consent of the parents wasn't always that clear. Charles gives us a sense of how that pedomazoma happened on the ground by visiting these children where these villages where children have already been kidnapped, as he calls it, and the distress of the parents. But also, he gives us a sense that this happens in a huge atmosphere of confusion. What is the way for a parent to save their child at that time? That is not clear to anyone. But the only thing is that is clear is that parents really want to save their children, whether that means to give them to the queen or to give them to the communists. Some families are basically pulled between the two, and the literature on that topic is still coming out and still being enriched, also by personal testimonies. What happens with most of the children of Charles' hostels, of Queen Frederica's pedopolis, is that they return to the villages. What happened with most of the children that were taken by the communists is that they never returned. That's a critical difference to make here. And that they could only come back if they wished as adults after some political reforms in the 80s, and only if they were Greek, not Slavo-Macedonian, another contested era. So we see a Charles then focusing on children with a lot of goodwill, but really being caught up in what's happening in northern Greece. Northern Greece being the hottest territory of the emerging Cold War, right? Of clearly also a proxy war for larger forces at work, in which the children become proxy pawns for adult maneuvers. So let's continue on then. So one of the things that Charles assists with is the evacuation of villages, of children from those villages to safer spots in southern Greece. Here he is being photographed as he accompanies one of these evacuations in these big ships that are headed for Piraeus. Photography, of course, does a lot to capture these moments, and this is clearly, as are the others that you will see, a staged picture. It's important that the children show, but it's also very important that you can read United Nations, right? With Charles in the picture. He goes around all of northern Greece in an old jeep that constantly breaks down, and he keeps constantly complaining about it. But he does give us an extraordinary sense of what conditions on the ground are, and just how difficult it is. A network of roads in northern Greece that are littered with landmines, leftovers of the civil war. So these are then some of the territories of northern Greece. So Charles then, for being there quite long, becomes everybody's contact person, right? He occasionally even gets captured on the road by the communists, spends 24 hours with the communists, has a few cigarettes, talks about the ideals they follow, gives his own view, gains actually quite an appreciation for their idealism, but constantly challenged the communists on the destruction that they also wreak. And so you can tell that he sees this all, he takes this in strides. He puts himself actually at a certain amount of risk as well. Let that be said. He becomes everyone's contact person. What do I mean by that? He is there for what is back in the days pretty much the longest, right? All Americans, all Brits eventually come and go. Charles is there to stay. After March 47, the British withdraw completely. The Americans come in with even larger amounts of money, the Marshall Plan from 48, and even more of a sense that it's going to depend on them and on nobody else, a certain arrogance with that. Charles at some point gets contacted by just about any journalist coming to study the situation in northern Greece, because they don't travel to these territories, they don't travel to the Yugoslavian border, they get their information from Charles. And when I check the record of the New York Times and other newspapers of the time, I can literally tell that they've talked to Charles. Occasionally they credit him, but more often they present it as their own knowledge, but I can see the literal wording of Charles emerge in these articles. And Charles is actually a little bit of a would-be, wannabe journalist himself, and sends some of his dispatches to newspapers. And this memoir is also eventually written to become a published travelogue memoir, but that never happened. I think the US pretty much lost interest. This is peripheral territory to the US, and Charles had a very hard time to get his work published, which eventually never happened, which is also why he basically left that legacy to his son. One of these people who seeks out Charles to get the scoop, all right, is George Polk, of all people. George Polk is known to you. He was the one, the CBS journalist, whose body was found floating in the Thessaloniki Bay, murdered. A murder that has been unresolved since, and has really quite captured the fascination of Edmund Keeley and other writers. Polk went to meet Charles. Charles didn't particularly like him. He felt Polk was a little arrogant, but he does say that Polk was killed because he knew too much. And sure enough, the Americans and the Greek right wing tried to pin it immediately on the communists, that they would have murdered Polk. But Polk knew a lot about corruption in the food distribution system, money, humanitarian aid money that was lining pockets, mishandling of committee work, partisan distributions. Polk indeed knew too much, and maybe too much for the right. And so over the years, our suspicion has shifted to maybe the right being the murderers of Polk, and then conveniently pinning it on a communist journalist whom they found as a scapegoat. But I've always wondered if Polk supposedly knew too much, can't we confidently say that our Charles knew even more and was actually writing equally critically, but at least less public about it? Another contact that Charles makes is the famous photographer David Seymour. And I want to show you, this is a picture taken by David Seymour, who became famous for capturing the post-war destruction of Europe in pictures that are today very carefully guarded and that are typically being charged at about $2,000 a picture, but that especially captured the pain of the children of Europe. And so you could see that Charles and David Seymour have a lot in common here, especially since Charles has really kind of photography as a hobby. So, what then about the sympathies and the criticisms of Charles? What happens is, we immediately kind of gravitate towards that question that is very important for the Greeks. Is he with the left? Is he with the right? Charles is actually with the children, let me say that. He is very critical of the right-wing government. He feels that they are steeped in corruption and mishandling of power and political appointments, haven't really cared for northern Greece all along, and certainly not for the speakers of other languages in northern Greece, whom he meets, the Turkish speakers, the Slavo-Macedonian speakers, he meets them all. The right has never cared. And Charles is quite critical that when the children go missing through the pedomasoma, all of a sudden the right, which has never cared for these children, all of a sudden makes a political issue of caring for those children. Equally critical, Charles is of the communist left, which he thinks, may expound a whole lot of idealism, but on they wreak an awful lot of destruction and exert a certain amount of coercion to bring an already desperate population on their side. But what really puts him over the hill and kind of kills his every last bit of sympathy for the communists, that is the destruction of the village of Naousa. He is one of the first people to enter Naousa after the communist destruction, and he gives us a very graphic description of what happened there. And that's the straw that breaks the camel back. And you can see that after that, he talks about the communists in terms of destruction, where already so much destruction has happened. But that description of Naousa is heartrending. So if we want to come then to the various levels of criticism that Charles exerts, there is criticism of the left, there's criticism of the right, there's criticism of Greece, along with a tremendous sympathy for the non-hierarchical Greeks, the helpless Greeks, the non-powerful Greeks. He doesn't have much love lost on Greek bureaucracies. And he feels that they're incredibly cumbersome, even in terms of emergency and in terms of need. Now, it's easy for him to criticize. He, after all, comes from what he thinks is a system that works, but he's equally critical of the tremendous bureaucracy of UNRRA, which is wrapped up in lists and reports and hirings and liquidations, and he feels that the Americans too don't handle their first experiment in humanitarian aid very well, and that again bureaucracy stands in the way of a certain immediacy that needs to apply when children are at stake. He feels that these children are in need of two products most of all. And the whole memoir is pervaded by two basic needs. One is shoes, because a whole lot of children go barefoot, and he feels that you can lift their morale, you can lift the parents' morale, you can bring them into a new era, to a new level of productivity if they only have shoes on their feet. And we remember the famous pictures of Seymour, of children hugging shoes that they just received. And another item that needs to be distributed is milk. canned milk, powdered milk, you name it. But milk is that supposedly magical product that needs to be available in abundance, that is going to raise, strong, healthy children. An element that is still in the Greek mentality. When I first went to Greece, I was just shocked by that emphasis on that glass of milk in the morning and on the Mikri Olandesa. I mean, coming from that part of the world, I have but I had never so much emphasis on milk. And yet, that next stronger generation, that clearly countries that are rebuilding need, that we need future leaders, strong, healthy children who overcome malaria, whatever they need to overcome, again with American help. That is very much the spirit of the late 1940s and the 1950s. The other side of that is that poor, unhealthy children will become easy fodder for the communists, right? So the two again go together. But if I may draw to a conclusion here, is I see Charles very much as a do-gooder, let's say, who indeed has a lot to offer, but equally much to learn from a country that has its own strong traditions, and those traditions should not be forgotten. It's not all about putting smiling children in a picture, nicely crafted, almost embracing a care package that is coming from the US, supposedly children who have no adults to help them. We are in an era in which the image of the unaccompanied orphaned child, whichever way that you take that, either literal or not so literal, has to do a lot of political work, is basically being put in front of a propaganda bandwagon. And Charles doesn't actually see that in a very clear-eyed way. But it is happening, and it is still happening for that matter. One last element of criticism that we don't expect so much from Charles, and I want to give a little bit of attention to, is Charles being critical of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. For being as religious as he is, that comes as a healthy surprise. And here's an exchange with the Bishop of Kalamata. And I won't read it in great detail, but we can go into it later. He basically challenges the Bishop of Kalamata, who's the head of a foundling shelter. He challenges him on the fact that these babies keep dying under his supervision, meaning he's not spending money on their care, on hygiene. And he makes a comparison with a shelter in Sparta where no children are dying. And so he calls out the bishop and says, "You're mishandling this." And the bishop says, "But we don't have any wet nurses." And Charles says, "But in Sparta, they give their babies canned milk and they do just well. They do just fine." And the bishop says, no, Greek children are different. They can't live off canned milk. That's only good for American children." And Charles retorts and says, "But in Sparta, they live off canned milk, and generations of American children have been thriving on canned milk. Canned milk doesn't kill anyone." And eventually the bishop says, "But aren't you happy that when these little babies die, once they have been baptized, they go straight to heaven? How can you stand in the way of that?" And at that moment, Charles just about loses it and says, and basically says, "We're not here to send them to heaven faster, right? We hope that they still have some life to spend on earth." But that's kind of the mentality that he's up against, and for which he doesn't hesitate to criticize the highest ranks of the ecclesiastical establishment. And here are the children, a little girl with her new shoes, way too big, but very proud. And I want to linger one moment on this last picture. Rebuilding is also about rebuilding churches. This iconostasis is actually rebuilt from cardboard boxes that represent humanitarian aid products. So you will see creamed butter, not for resale. And all these boxes, whom the English people don't read, form a new kind of iconostasis while we await a more permanent structure. I think that's where the Greeks' love affair with the good cardboard box ever began. So on this note, then, I want to end by saying that in a time of disruption, in a time where nothing lasted more than a few months, and certainly not the Greek government back in the day, Charles, in a peculiar way, in a paradoxical way, for being there for 5 years, 5 committed years, actually represents an element of continuity. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonda, for that fascinating presentation. And I'm sure there'll be a few questions from the audience, but I just might kickstart the questioning. On that issue of the relocation of children, whether it was either by the left or the right, Lauren Danforth and also your compatriot Ricky had about it. And I think their conclusion was, on balance, both children on either side were better off for it. I think that's the final conclusion of the book, because where they were so destitute, anything was sort of an improvement. I just want to pick you up on a point that those that did go to Eastern Europe, actually some did return. There are cases of some that came back from Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, and Yugoslavia, mainly because Tito fell out with Stalin, right? Some came back from Yugoslavia, but it's a small number compared to...
It's a small number, that's right, it's a small number. And there are also a few cases of children being in both situations, like, yes, being in childcare centers in Eastern Europe, but then also coming back to Greece and going to the Frederica orphanages as well. So I've come across a few of those examples too. So it's, it's an area that still needs a lot of research to be done. And I'm sure a lot of us have probably met people in life that were one of those children as well. More just a comment rather than a question. Those shoes, were they actually made in Greece, or they were imported? They were given to children. Have you managed to sort of find out? Or?
The shoes were imported, and a lot of the clothing is actually secondhand, including the shoes. The shoes are very often secondhand, meaning they have been used, pre-loved, as we say. They are rejects from other countries, basically. So a lot of what UNRRA does and what all these various organizations do is they mobilize whoever they know in the United States, churches, organizations, student groups, you name it, to do clothing drives. And so they receive a lot of secondhand clothing and secondhand shoes, and a lot of that kind of material gets distributed. There are not many new pairs of shoes going on around here. Very often it's reused material.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking a probably more creative way would have been to sort of train up sort of shoemakers or set up small enterprises. Because it's one of the few professions that sort of Greeks had, like semi-skilled professions at the time of the war. And
they do it with clothing. There is some clothing that is being sent over, meaning cloth that is being sent over as rolls, bales of cloth, as a way to then give the assignment to the Greek textile clothing manufacturers to make simple clothing out of them and distribute that as a way also of bringing money to an industry that needs a little injection of funds. There is also that, but not for shoes. Shoes are considered too laborious to make at that moment. It's easier to just import them.
And do we know, once Charles left Greece, went back to the US, what did he concern himself with? I mean, what trajectory did his life take, and where did he end up?
It's interesting. He thinks that, and David, his son, also thinks that because he was to the left and quite open to learning about, other ideologies. Charles was convinced, and David too, that he was a little bit, how shall I say, on the blacklist. He had Charles Schermerhorn had the hardest time moving back into a career after he came back from Europe. But age can have something to do with that. By then he was in his late 40s. Age can have something to do with that. He was a pretty outspoken character. He didn't mince words. It took him a long time to establish himself in a job. In fact, his wife had to kind of step in and make sure that, the family had a provider. And eventually he found a job as a social worker in a community center in the Los Angeles area. But it took several years before we got there.
But don't forget, when he would have returned to the state, you almost had the peak of McCarthyism as well.
Exactly. He fell right into that. Yeah. And for having been abroad and exposed to other things and having published a few articles in the newspaper, he may have been a known entity with sympathies that were certainly suspect. Let's put, or at least suspect in the minds of people who are paranoid. And he attributes that kind of suspicion, to that kind of suspicion, he attributes the fact that it took him several years to land a solid job again.
Okay, all right. No, as I said, absolutely fascinating story. And has the research sort of ceased now, or is there a next phase of this research? Or?
There is a next phase, but not necessarily coming from me. And that somebody is studying the correspondence, because a lot of letters went back and forth between Charles and some donors, family members, and his wife did the same. And that conversation through correspondence is also preserved. And then, of course, there are the 300 pictures that are pictures taken of conditions on the ground in these remote villages in northern Greece. So there is a lot of work that can be done with that kind of material as well.
You mentioned during your presentation you had sort of interaction with a lot of minority groups in northern Greece and so forth.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that? What else does he say about those interactions?
For instance, he will come upon villages that speak only Turkish. And he has an Armenian interpreter.
But when you say only Turkish, is that because they were, let's say, Pontian refugees or Asia Minor refugees, and they were, yeah.
Exactly. He doesn't know enough of the interwar history of Greece. So he's actually kind of surprised that he finds pockets of Turkish-speaking Greeks in northern Greece in remote villages. And it's his Armenian interpreter who actually speaks Turkish, who has to explain to him how this came about. So he gets kind of a crash course in Greek history, explaining to him that a lot of these people in northern Greece are already once displaced, have already lost everything, to then be settled in remote villages, to then be driven from those villages to larger city centers, to be out of the path of the communists for two reasons, both for their safety, but also so that they can't provide support to the communists. And so they get caught up time and again in these sweeps of military and political action. And these are very displaced, very fragile lives in which the children in particular suffer. So he gets quite a quick education in that background. But yes, he is surprised to find pockets of Turkish-speaking Greeks in remote villages in northern Greece, and of course, Slavo-Macedonian speakers.
And what did he have to say about the Slavophone-speaking?
He notices, first of all, that one family actually puts him up for the night, and he notices various things, that they're very hospitable, that they speak a language he can't understand and his interpreter cannot understand, but that they can switch to Greek if they need to, that they're pretty well-to-do, that they clearly, they have a stone house, a two-story stone house, which is noteworthy, that they are
these
very
are villages
well
in
integrated.
Florina, or which particular?
Close to Florina, yeah. And that they clearly have made a certain amount of money from the trade in animals, and that they are very, dare I say, well integrated, well respected in their communities.
Okay. Okay, no, that's not a question there yet. I think we might bring proceedings to the close because we've sort of just passed the hour, Gonda. Thanks once again for your presentation. Best of luck with any sort
Thank
of
you.
future research, and who knows, maybe we'll see you in Australia one day again as well when you can present at our centre. Okay.
Yeah. And I want to hear a little more of her. Actually, if I may take an extra moment to reverse the question, tell me, Nick, how what light can your research now shed on what I just described? You know, because you see the refugees when they've reached the communist satellite states. So tell me what kind of villages, what kind of contacts have you been able to make that build immediately on the turbulent history of these Northern
Well,
Greek
I mean,
populations?
I'm specifically looking at sort of Tashkent or Soviet Uzbekistan, where there were mainly adults that went there. But what you see in the first few years attempts to reunite families. Okay, so you see the migration of children and older adults coming to Tashkent, and the other way around as well, and reverse as well. So there were, yes, although the families were pulled apart and so forth, there were attempts to reunite families because I think everyone agreed that, the best position for a child is to be with their natural parents, if possible, if
Of
circumstances
course.
allow. So you do see those population movements in the first few years in political exile, attempts to reunite the children. And as I said, on balance, you also see their social mobility because they receive their care. And when you have peace, you can get an education, you can get trained up, you can go to school, and you can sort of see their progress. But it's a massive topic, and yeah.
Yeah, well, we look forward to your presentation, Nick, and I'm actually very pleased that these hidden sides and very often the personal story that helps us nuance the bigger picture of history, that these personal sides get the attention they deserve. I think, especially in the writing of modern Greek history, we have a lot of work to do to kind of transcend the level of leaders and military conflicts to look at
When
how
you look at
families, for
when you talk
instance,
about big
what
picture, you're
for.
missing a lot of the, the lower level details, and yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but good. I look forward to it, and I want to say a special call out to Russell Gornborn, whose name I saw just appear. Good to see you this way, Russell. And again, Penny, thank you very much. Nick Costas, it's always a pleasure to
Thank
work
you,
with
and,
you.
and
Thank you.
and please just stay on the line for a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.